Welcome back. This is part 2 of Knowledge Targeting, the 50-part documentary series from TI1 Voice, and it is called The Anatomy of Gang Stalking. Part 1 asked what organized stalking is. This episode asks how it works, the tactics, the staging, the settings, and the electronic layer many targets describe. 2 hours taken slowly. It is built on Chapter 2 of the series book and on the TI1 Voice knowledge base. That single sentence from Eleanor White is the key to everything that follows. Read it slowly because every clause carries weight. The tactics are customized, not random, not identical from person to person. They are drawn from a menu, a shared catalog, finite, describable. And they are assembled for each individual target, which means variation is the rule. Any attempt to describe this as one fixed script fails before it starts. Knowledge targeting gathers, in one place, what the targeted individual community has managed to learn about its own situation. 50 episodes, roughly 2 hours each, drawn from a knowledge base of thousands of documents, books, declassified files, patents, court records, medical papers, and first-person testimony, assembled by TI1 Voice. The aim is not to convince you. The aim is to set the material out honestly, mark what is proven, and let you weigh the rest yourself. This is part 2 of 50, and the second episode of section 1, which runs for 10 parts and defines the phenomenon before any technology is discussed. The episodes are built to be watched in order, but each one stands alone. If this is the first you have found, you are not starting at a disadvantage. Everything part 1 established will be restated here, briefly, wherever this chapter depends on it. Part 1 was called Organized Stalking, a Target's View. It gave the definition: many participants, one target, sustained over years, built from acts too small to charge. Part 3, which follows this one, is called the Why You Question, and it asks how targets are selected and what motives are claimed. Between the definition and the motive sits this episode, the anatomy, what the crime is made of and how the parts fit. A word about where this series comes from. TI1 Voice is a documentation platform built by targets for targets. It holds an evidence library where incidents are recorded with dates, times, locations, and attachments. A knowledge base of thousands of indexed source documents, searchable by meaning rather than keyword. A community wall. Secure messaging in dozens of languages, and structured interviews that turn scattered memory into a record. It is free. TI1voice.org. There is also TI-TV, a live stream that runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, documentaries, interviews, recorded talks, and community programming, free to watch, no account needed. You will find it at meet.witisk.org, under Public, TI-TV, and every part of this series exists as a written article as well, with the sources listed so you can read what you have heard and follow the citations yourself. It is fair to ask how a script like this is written. Each section begins with a question put to the TI1 Voice knowledge base. Thousands of documents indexed so that passages can be retrieved by meaning rather than by keyword. Chapter 2 of the series book supplies the spine. The archive supplies corroboration, numbers, and counterarguments. Where a claim appears in this episode, the document it came from can be named. For rules govern this series, and this episode will lean on all four. Documented fact and contested claim are kept visibly apart. No private individual is ever named as a perpetrator, not by us and not in the testimony we quote. Quotations stay short and attributed. And where the evidence runs out, we say so. That last rule matters here, because much of what this chapter describes has never been independently verified. One more thing, for anyone watching who recognizes this from the inside. The next 2 hours describe harassment in close detail, noise, vehicles, staged encounters, sensations. That can be hard listening. Nothing here is a diagnosis, and nothing here is advice about your own situation. We will not tell you what is or is not happening to you. Support links are in the description. Pause whenever you need to and come back. Here is the road ahead. First, the master menu itself, and why 10 targets telling 10 different stories may be evidence of design rather than delusion. Second, the staging principle, how each visible act is dressed as one of life's normal breaks. Third, the tactics, street theater, noise, vehicles. Fourth, the settings where harassment concentrates, work, home, school, medicine. And fifth, the electronic layer where the claims become hardest to test. So let us begin the chapter proper. If part 1 established what organized stalking is, this chapter examines how it works, and it starts with a single organizing image. Not a script, not a protocol, a menu, a large shared catalog of methods, from which one particular program is assembled for one particular person. Understand the menu, and the scattered testimony starts to resolve into something with a grammar of its own. Take White's sentence clause by clause. Customized means tailored, chosen for this person, in this place, at this moment. A menu means the catalog is finite, large but describable, which is what makes analysis possible at all. And for each individual target means the tailoring is the rule, not the exception. Those three ideas together do most of the analytic work in this chapter, so it is worth fixing them now. Now to the puzzle that has damaged the credibility of targeted individuals more than anything else. They do not agree with each other. Sit 10 of them in a room and you will hear 10 different emphases, 10 different sets of tactics, 10 different worlds. To a journalist, a police officer, or a clinician hearing this for the first time, it sounds like 10 private stories rather than one shared crime. Listen to what the 10 actually say. One describes a workplace turned hostile, colleagues who freeze them out, supervisors manufacturing performance complaints. Another describes a neighborhood turned into a stage. Unfamiliar faces on rotation, vehicles appearing and disappearing on a schedule. A third describes sensations, buzzing, pressure, voices that seem to come from inside the head. A fourth describes staged coincidence. Strangers repeating private phrases, objects appearing where they should not. For accounts, for different worlds, and the outsider draws the obvious conclusion. If these people were describing one phenomenon, surely they would describe the same experiences. The divergence gets read as disconfirming, as evidence that the accounts are generated inside the head rather than caused outside it. That inference is not malicious. It is ordinary reasoning, and it is the single largest obstacle these testimonies face when they reach an institution. White's model does not deny the divergence. It reframes it. If there is one large catalog of techniques, and each program is assembled by selecting a different subset, then divergent stories are exactly what the model predicts. The same reasoning runs in both directions, so be careful. A model that explains any possible testimony explains nothing. What gives this one traction is the claim that the same small set of methods keeps recurring. The menu is the constant, the meal is the variable. That formulation does a lot of work, and it is worth being precise about what it can and cannot establish. It can explain why divergent accounts need not be dismissed. It cannot, on its own, demonstrate that a catalog exists or that anyone is choosing from it. Those remain claims. This chapter describes a model. It does not prove one. There is a mirror image argument worth stating. If every target told an identical story, same tactics, same timing, that uniformity would itself be suspicious, suggesting accounts shaped by a shared template rather than lived experience. And the TI-1 voice corpus analysis has found exactly that in places, near-identical reporting templates repeated across different users. Shared vocabulary can produce shared testimony. Honest analysis has to hold both possibilities open at once. So picture the menu not as a recipe but as an audio mixing board, with dozens of channels: street theater, noise, vehicles, workplace mobbing, electronic effects, rumor, institutional pressure, each with its own slider. For one target, the noise channel is pushed to maximum and the workplace sits at 0. For another, the reverse. Same board, different mix. In the next stretch, we start pushing those sliders one at a time. Someone's hand is on those sliders. White uses the word handler deliberately. It implies a coordinator with some degree of operational control, not a crowd acting on impulse. The handler pushes one channel high and leaves another near silent, then adjusts the mix over months and years. That is a claim about structure, not a documented job title. But it follows logically from customization. Somebody, somewhere, is choosing which items get selected. Picture the board itself. Street theater. Noise. Vehicles. Workplace mobbing. Rumor. Institutional friction. And, for many targets, an electronic layer on top of all of it. These are the channel names that recur across the literature, and the knowledge base catalogs several of them as community terms in their own right. Flooding, for instance, meaning bodies crowded around a person in public. The vocabulary is reasonably settled by now. The mix never is. Now the model explains something skeptics rarely account for. Targets across the literature do not describe a steady state. They describe waves, a punishing stretch of one tactic, then a lull that makes them wonder whether it is finally over, then a fresh wave in a different key. A bad month of vehicle convoys subsides. Hope creeps back in, cautiously, against accumulated experience. Then the noise campaign starts or the workplace turns. The shape repeats. A wave of one tactic. Then a lull, long enough for the nervous system to stand down. Then hope, which is the expensive part. Then a new wave, usually on a different channel, so the defenses built during the last one are useless. White's argument is that the lull is not a gap in the operation and not a sign of winding down. The lull is part of the instrument. Sit with what a lull actually does. If the pressure were constant and uniform, a person would eventually adapt. Humans are extraordinarily good at building routines around unpleasant constants. Noisy neighbors, a difficult commute, chronic pain. Adaptation is our defense. The lull removes it. Just as the target starts to rebuild something like an ordinary week, the next wave lands, and it lands harder precisely because it follows a stretch of calm. Unpredictability, then, is not a byproduct. It is the weapon. A threat you can schedule is a threat you can prepare for. You can clear the evening, brace, ration your energy. A threat that could arrive tonight or in 11 weeks has to be braced against permanently. And permanent bracing is exhausting in a way that the incidents themselves are not. The waiting does damage the incidents never have to do. This is not an exotic mechanism. The knowledge base entry on so-called white torture describes exactly the same logic, techniques that heighten anxiety by creating a sense of unpredictable threat. Its companion entry on stress inoculation training names the inverse, coercive stress conditioning, the deliberate, non-consensual application of stress to induce psychological change. Those are descriptions of documented coercive environments. Applying them to organized stalking is an analogy, and it should be labeled as one. 3 consequences follow from that design. Routine is denied, because no routine survives a change of channel. Recovery is punished, because every recovery becomes the baseline from which the next fall is measured. And no stable model of the world can form. The target cannot answer the simplest question, which is what happens next. Coercion researchers have a name for this pattern. Intermittent pressure destabilizes more thoroughly than continuous pressure, and it does so by design. Set the 2 regimes side by side and the difference is stark. Constant pressure is predictable, so rhythms form, and the impact flattens over time. Intermittent pressure offers nothing to learn. Every routine breaks. The impact compounds instead of flattening. That asymmetry is why White insists the modulation is deliberate rather than accidental. An operation that simply ran out of steam would not resume in another key. Again, that is her inference, not a proven finding. Now the mixing board explains a third thing, the hardest for the Lone Stalker theory to absorb. White stresses and targets across the literature confirm that relocation brings no real break. Not a new city, not a new country. People sell houses, change jobs, cross oceans, and within days or weeks the same categories of incident begin in the new place. That is the claim. It is reported consistently, and it is not independently verified. Think about what portability requires. A lone stalker with a fixation cannot follow someone across a national border. Not for years, not while holding a job, not without a passport trail that would be trivial to subpoena. A network can, and it does not need to travel at all. It hands the file to a node that is already there. The cast changes completely. The script, adjusted for local conditions, does not. The new node may emphasize different channels. A rural posting offers different opportunities than a dense apartment block, and the local mix will reflect that. But the continuity, targets say, is unmistakable. Same categories of staged encounter. Same kinds of noise. Same slow souring of a new workplace. On the menu model, this is exactly what you would predict because what crosses the border is not a stalker. It is a description of a person. Is a distributed harassment network plausible at all? The knowledge base points to documented precedent. The 1971 burglary at the Media, Pennsylvania field office revealed that the FBI had monitored and disrupted peaceful political activity. The Socialist Workers' Party litigation established a pattern of surveillance without evidence of crime, infiltration, and personal sabotage. Those are court records and congressional findings, real and settled. They establish capability. They do not establish that this is happening now. And here the evidence runs out, so the line should be marked plainly. The knowledge base states, in its own entry on surveillance hardware, that no documented evidence supports the existence of organized gang stalking programs. Its entry on the 1000-event memory log, a common self-documentation practice, notes that such logs carry no recognized evidentiary value in court, and that critics warn they can reinforce confirmation bias. Both things are true at once. Which brings us to the question that should follow any model. What does it buy you? White argues the master menu matters for 3 reasons beyond the ones already covered. It makes systematic documentation possible. It answers the most common way targets are dismissed. And, crucially, it can be wrong. It generates predictions that a large enough body of accounts could confirm or refute. Take those in order because the third one carries real weight. Reason 1. If the harassment were genuinely idiosyncratic, every target experiencing something unique and unrepeatable, then research would be impossible because there would be nothing to compare. The menu model asserts the opposite. Beneath the surface variety sits a finite, describable set of tactics. Name them, catalog them, count how often each appears. On that model, every account stops being an anecdote and becomes a data point about which items are in active use. Reason 2. Targets are routinely dismissed with a single move. Your account does not match hers. Therefore, neither of you is reliable. Under the menu model, that move fails. 2 accounts can diverge completely and both be accurate reports of different selections from one catalog. The divergence is not a contradiction. It is a measurement of the menu's range. Whether the menu exists is the open question, but the logic itself is sound. Reason 3, and this is the one that separates a model from a belief. If the master menu is real, specific things should show up in a large sample. The same tactics should recur at rates above chance. Certain tactics should cluster together more often than others, implying the menu has internal structure. And the overall spread should look structured, neither the random scatter of unrelated private experience nor the flat uniformity of a shared script. That test is not hypothetical. The knowledge base describes an initiative called SCORE, in which participants complete structured attack documentation interviews, each scored on a 0 to 10 evidence quality scale weighing corroboration density, completeness, temporal proximity, and cross-referencing. It projected over 1.4 million structured submissions from roughly 14,000 active participants. Note the word projected. That is a plan and a forecast, not a published result, and it should be read as one. White does not run that analysis. The data collection it needs is beyond any single volume, so the hypothesis is offered as an invitation to researchers better placed to test it. And there is a warning inside the data already. The knowledge base notes that many logs are near identical because targets share templates, which can manufacture the very uniformity the model warns against. Next, how each act is staged to look like life's normal breaks. The master menu tells us what is done. It does not tell us how each item is presented to the world. That question belongs to a second principle, and it is arguably the more important of the two. Eleanor White gives it a single line, almost in passing, but that line explains why the phenomenon she describes has proved so resistant to investigation. Everything else in this chapter rests on it. So read the sentence carefully. Here is the principle in White's own framing. Stalking attacks which are visible are always designed to appear, to a casual observer, as life's normal breaks. Every word there is load-bearing. Visible because much of the campaign is meant to be seen. Casual because the disguise only has to survive a glance. And normal breaks because the cover story is misfortune, and misfortune is something everyone already believes in. That is the whole trick, stated plainly. A conventional crime hides itself. The burglar works at night, wears a mask, leaves no fingerprints. The fraudster buries the paper trail. Even the classic lone stalker tries to keep his identity from the victim and his activity from the police. In every case, the criminal acts to prevent discovery of the act. Organized stalking, White argues, inverts that logic completely. The acts are performed in the open. What is concealed is the coordination. So the perpetrators are not trying to stop anyone seeing what they do. They are trying to stop anyone recognizing it as coordinated. That is a different security problem, and it calls for a different disguise. Concealment protects the ordinary criminal. Ordinariness protects this one. The safest place to commit an act of organized harassment on this model is in public, in daylight, in front of witnesses who will remember nothing worth reporting. Consider the raw material. A rude stranger on the street is not a crime. A car that sounds its horn at an awkward moment is not a crime. A neighbor's appliance running at 3 in the morning is not a crime. A cold look from a colleague, a delivery that goes astray, an appointment canceled without explanation, a pedestrian who walks slowly in front of you. Each has an innocent explanation any reasonable person would accept. And that acceptance is the entire point. The items are chosen precisely because they are ordinary, trivial, indistinguishable from the friction of daily life. The alleged crime does not live in any one of them. It lives in the aggregation. Not one rude stranger, but a different rude stranger every day for a year, each making remarks that seem to touch details of your private life. The unit of analysis is the series. Not one canceled appointment, but cancellations that cluster around the appointments that matter most. Not one vehicle on your street, but a rotation of vehicles arriving at the same hour, or whenever you leave the house, or vanishing whenever you reach for a camera. Targets report this shape again and again. Whether it reflects coordination or coincidence is precisely what cannot be settled from a single fragment, and fragments are all that outsiders get. No casual witness is present for enough incidents to see the shape. Only the target is there for all of them because all of them are aimed at the target. So when the target carries that accumulated pattern to a police officer who has seen one fragment, or none, the account sounds self-evidently implausible. And it would be implausible if the fragments were all that existed. The staging guarantees that fragments are all anyone else sees. This produces a paradox White treats as central to the crime's durability. In ordinary criminal conspiracy, deniability falls as the group grows. More participants means more witnesses, more potential informants, more chances that somebody blunders or leaves a trace. Prosecutors count on it. In organized stalking, as White models it, the arithmetic runs backwards. Deniability rises with the size of the group. That inversion, if it holds, changes what investigators should be looking for. The mechanism is simple. The more people take part, the smaller each contribution can be. The smaller the contribution, the more ordinary the individual act looks, and the harder the coordination is to trace across the whole network. White compresses it into one line, and the line does a great deal of work. It is also, note, an assertion about design rather than a finding about any documented network. Keep that distinction in view. The architecture explains how. A coordinator may understand the whole pattern, but the coordinator is insulated from the acts. They did not sound the horn. They did not make the remark. They did not drive the car. The foot soldier performs the act without seeing its place in anything larger. Asked to keep an eye on something, to mention something, to be somewhere at a certain time. No single node holds enough to incriminate the network. Which brings us to the evidentiary problem underneath all of this. Every prosecution needs evidence, and evidence in the standard model comes from witnesses, people who saw something, heard something, or can speak to a pattern. The staging principle is, in effect, a machine for ensuring that no single witness ever sees enough to testify to anything at all. Call it the fragmented witness problem. It closes into a loop that feeds itself. Picture 3 witnesses. A neighbor notices a car parked outside the house at an odd hour. A colleague notices the target getting a cold shoulder from someone normally friendly. A passerby hears a stranger make an odd remark on the street. None of the 3 knows about the other 2. None thinks their fragment worth reporting. And even convened in one room, which never happens, they would not recognize a single story. If the pattern is only visible from the target's seat, then the obvious countermove is to pool the seats. The knowledge base describes an initiative called SCORE, which collects structured attack documentation, interviews, and projects, accumulating over 1.4 million submissions from an estimated 14,000 active participants. Note the word projects. That is a target, not an achievement, and the distinction matters enormously when the whole enterprise is about evidentiary standards. Each submission is scored. The knowledge base sets out an evidence quality scoring model that rates an account from 0 to 10, waiting for things, how densely it is corroborated, how complete the data is, how close the report sits to the event in time, and how richly it cross-references other accounts. Whatever one concludes about the phenomenon, that is a serious answer to the fragmented witness problem. Aggregate the fragments and score them honestly. Is there precedent for treating scattered fragments as a pattern? There is, and it is documented. Between 1956 and 1971, the FBI ran SOINTELPRO. The National Security Agency watch-listed American citizens under Operation Minaret. A citizen's break-in at a field office in Media, Pennsylvania put the files into public hands, and Senate hearings followed. Precedent proves capability. It does not prove any particular case, and that limit must be stated plainly. That leaves the target in an impossible position. They are the only person holding the evidence of coordination, and they are also the person whose testimony is discounted automatically, because they are the complainant, because they plainly want to be believed, because the account sounds far-fetched, and because the mental health system stands ready to reframe the complaint as a symptom. The seat with the best view is the seat with the least credibility. So targets log. The knowledge base describes a practice sometimes called the 1000-event memory log, a running record of incidents, timestamps, and patterns. It also records the criticism squarely. Such logs sit outside academic and legal frameworks. They can entrench confirmation bias by cataloging only what fits, and courts have granted them no recognized evidentiary status. Both things are true at once. A log is not proof, but without one there is nothing to test. The TI-1 voice declaration guide puts the instruction bluntly and immediately follows it with a list of what the exercise will not do. It does not start an investigation. It does not provide legal representation. It does not stop the attacks. And, in the guide's own words, it does not guarantee anyone will believe you. That honesty is unusual, and it is the right register for a problem built entirely out of deniability. Hold on to the staging principle because everything in the next section is an application of it. If the principle has a purest form, a single tactic that expresses it completely, White says it is street theater. Small scenes, played in public, by strangers who look like passers-by, timed to your arrival and built out of details from your private life. Watch how ordinary it stays, and how little a bystander would think worth remembering. The staging principle produces evidence and destroys its usefulness in the same motion. To see how completely that works, we now narrow the lens to a single tactic. Of everything on the master menu, one item is the purest distillation of staging. Eleanor White calls it street theater. Small, brief harassment scenes, performed in public, in plain view of the target, by strangers who look like nothing more than ordinary passers-by. The word theater is doing real work here. A skit is a performance. It has a script, a cast, a stage, and an audience of exactly one. The knowledge base holds an older gang-stalking reference describing the same tactic as skits performed by people complicit in the harassment, deliberately built to imitate the breaks of normal living. That phrase, the breaks of normal living, is the whole design compressed into 4 words. That line comes from a gang-stalking reference file in the knowledge base, and it flags something important. The name sounds light. Street theater suggests mime artists and buskers, something almost charming. The same source calls it perfect cover for the perpetrators, and notes that many people know in advance that describing it will discredit them. So they delay complaining. Some delay even admitting it to themselves. The name disarms the crime. White's account gives a skit 3 essential properties, and each one contributes to its deniability. It is aggressively ordinary on the surface. It carries a private meaning that only the target can decode. And its timing is choreographed to the target's own movements. Take any one of the 3 away and the tactic collapses into noise. Hold all 3 together and you get something a target cannot mistake and cannot prove. Property 1. Surface ordinariness. 2 people talking on a corner. Somebody wearing a particular color. A car playing a particular song. A stranger who coughs or sneezes or drops something at a particular moment. Nothing in the surface content would strike a casual observer as unusual because people talk, wear colors, play music, cough and drop things constantly. The raw material of the tactic is the most abundant substance in public life. The utterly unremarkable. Property 2. The skit carries a private meaning. The phrase the stranger repeats is one the target used in a private conversation. The color has significance in the target's personal history. The song references a memory the target has never shared publicly. A gesture mirrors something the target did behind a closed door. The content is selected to reference something only the target, and whoever is watching the target would recognize. Here is the asymmetry at the center of the tactic. A bystander sees one man on a phone saying an unremarkable sentence. The target hears a sentence they spoke in their kitchen for days earlier. Same event. 2 irreconcilable readings, and only one of them can be photographed. The bystander's version needs no explanation. The target's version needs an entire theory of surveillance before it makes any sense at all. Property 3. The timing is choreographed. The phrase lands as the target walks past. The car pulls up as the target reaches the curb. The gesture is made exactly as the target looks that way. The scene is not running on its own schedule. It appears to be cued by the target's arrival. Some material in the knowledge base suggests real-time coordination by radio or phone apps, though that mechanism remains a claim, not a finding. Now separate the three properties again, and watch the tactic dissolve. A stranger who says a familiar phrase may simply have said it. A person wearing a color may simply like that color. A gesture at a particular second may simply be a gesture. Extracted from the pattern, every element has an innocent explanation that any reasonable person would accept immediately. That is not a weakness in the tactic. That is the tactic. There is also a well-established clinical explanation, and honesty requires stating it clearly. Apophenia is the documented human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random data. In psychiatry, assigning personal significance to neutral events is called a delusion of reference. Any mental health professional hearing a street theater account would reach for that framework first, and they would not be being careless. It is the standard reading, and it cannot be dismissed out of hand. So the target sits in a strange position. From inside the pattern, the accumulation feels unmistakable. The specificity of the references, the sheer improbability of so many coincidences aligning. From outside, it is unprovable because each incident, lifted out of the sequence, is trivial. There is nothing to photograph, nothing to record, nothing that would survive even a gentle cross-examination. This is psychological warfare with almost no forensic footprint at all. Street theater does a second job beyond the harassment itself. It gaslights. The word comes from Patrick Hamilton's 1938 play Gaslight, in which a husband dims the lamps and then tells his wife she is imagining it. 2 film adaptations carried it into popular memory. Decades later, it entered the medical literature, and by 2022 Merriam-Webster made gaslighting its word of the year. The idea traveled a long way. Classic gaslighting denies that the event occurred. Street theater does not need to. The phrase was spoken. The color was worn. The gesture was made. Nobody has to deny any of it because on the surface it is all too ordinary to be worth denying. What gets denied is the meaning. The target says this has happened dozens of times. The listener says people say things, and you are reading too much into it. The effect is identical either way. The target stops trusting their own ability to tell coincidence from coordination. And isolation multiplies it. In ordinary life, we calibrate constantly. Did that seem strange to you? Was he rude? Or am I overreacting? Has anyone else noticed this? Those small social checks are exactly what organized stalking removes, because the people who would normally provide them have been alienated, recruited, or simply never saw enough. The knowledge base makes the same point from a different direction. Margaret Singer's work on coercive persuasion identifies isolation as the critical component, because it makes one source the only source of validation. Entries on white torture describe how removing social confirmation produces depersonalization and loss of identity. So when a target begins to doubt themselves, that is not evidence of illness. It is the predictable result of losing every external anchor. There is one more layer, and it says something about the people running these campaigns. Street theater is not only harassment. It is a spectacle of surveillance. Every skit carries a second message underneath the first one. We see you. We know what you say in private. We know what you worry about. We know things you have told nobody, or told only one person. Your privacy is an illusion. That message has a strategic function. It removes the idea that any space is out of reach. In the target's experience, the bedroom becomes transparent. So does the therapist's office. So does the private journal. For many targets, this is more destabilizing than anything that happens on the street, because it erodes the boundary between self and world that psychological integrity depends on. If nothing is private, then nothing is safe. It is worth being precise about what targets actually describe, because vague accounts invite vague dismissals. The knowledge base entry on street theater lists the alternative names in circulation. Stage scenarios, skits, directed theater. The reported forms are narrower than people assume, and they recur across countries and decades with unsettling consistency. These are reports, not verified events. But their consistency is itself a datum, and it is the datum that most needs explaining. Assessing this from outside is genuinely hard. The claim rests on private information surfacing in public, and no single instance can be checked. Did the thought precede the mention? Did the mention reference that thought? There is no way to know. Targets keep incident logs, some running to 1,000 entries, and the knowledge base is blunt about them. Those logs have no recognized evidentiary value in any court of law. So the skepticism is not unreasonable on its face. But something still needs accounting for. Thousands of reports, across decades, across continents, describing the same scenes in strikingly similar language. Coincidence struggles because the base rate for that many specific matches is vanishingly low. Mass delusion struggles too, because shared delusional disorders spread and look quite different clinically. Next, the tactic targets describe as the most relentless of all: noise. Street theater works in daylight, in public, where strangers can be watched and then forgotten. The next tactic on the master menu works after dark, at home, in the one place a target still expects to be safe. It sits high on many targets' lists, and not because it is dramatic. It is there because it is relentless, and because it attacks the most basic biological need a human being has: sleep. White's account of the noise campaign is unusual for how consistent the language is across accounts. Banging from an adjoining wall or ceiling timed targets report to the moments they lie down, and easing once they give up and rise. Engines revving outside a window at hours when nobody has ordinary business on a residential street. Car alarms at intervals too regular to feel accidental. Doors slamming next door, again on cue. The rest of the repertoire is equally mundane. Power tools and lawn equipment run at odd hours, or long past any plausible purpose. Construction noise starts early and stops late. And there is the thudding bass, music with heavy low-frequency content, played just below the volume that would draw complaints from anyone else, but carried easily through a shared wall or floor. Nothing here is exotic. Every item is available to any neighbor, anywhere. Each individual noise carries a perfectly innocent explanation. Neighbors have appliances that bang. Alarms malfunction. People are inconsiderate. Building work happens at inconvenient hours. Any single event reported on its own would be dismissed by a reasonable listener as ordinary nuisance, unpleasant but not criminal. And that, once again, is the design. The perpetrators are not hiding the noise. They are hiding the fact that the noise is coordinated and chosen for one person. So what separates a noise campaign from ordinary urban racket? White's answer is the timing and what she calls response contingency. In a campaign, the noise behaves as though it is watching. It intensifies when the target tries to sleep and eases when the target gives up on sleeping. It moves to whichever wall the target is nearest. Ordinary noise does not track one person's body around one person's home. The contingency also survives a change of address. Targets report that when they move, the noise campaign resumes at the new location, often within days. That is the detail that most resists an innocent reading. A person can be unlucky in one building. Being unlucky in the same specific way in 3 buildings in 3 neighborhoods is a different kind of claim. Here the pattern is the evidence, and only the pattern is. Follow what happens when the target complains. The noise begins as they go to bed. Every individual sound has a lawful explanation. The target reports a coordinated campaign. The report reaches an officer or a landlord as a neighbor dispute, and is filed as one. Nothing in that loop requires anybody to disbelieve the target. It only requires them to hear the ordinary explanation first, which is exactly what they will hear. The knowledge base carries the noise campaign as a defined concept in its own right, listed as a component of the wider gangstalking claim, alongside a related entry called flooding, the crowding of a target in public space. The same entries are careful to record that the existence of organized stalking is disputed, and that critics attribute the reports to mental health conditions. Both things are true at once. The tactic is catalogued. The phenomenon is unproven. The objective, in most accounts, is sleep disruption, and sleep disruption is not a small thing. Sustained sleep deprivation is one of the best documented instruments of coercion we have. It has been used in interrogation, in torture, in military selection, and in cult indoctrination, not as a byproduct of something else but as a deliberate method for dismantling a person's psychological defenses. That is documented history, independent of any claim about stalking. The mechanism is well understood. Sleep loss degrades attention, so events are missed. It degrades memory, so events are misremembered. It degrades emotional regulation, so ordinary provocations produce disproportionate responses. And it degrades judgment, the capacity to weigh what matters against what does not. Put those four together and you have a description of a person who can no longer document their own life accurately, or account for it convincingly to anyone else. So the noise campaign attacks the target's credibility from the inside. It does not need to silence anyone by force. It degrades the target's own capacity to be a good witness on their own behalf. The person who arrives at a police station exhausted, frayed, struggling to lay out a clean timeline, is the person most easily set aside as unreliable or unwell. The exhaustion arrives before the complaint does. White frames this as a preemptive strike against the target's ability to seek help, and there is a further cruelty in it. The effects of sleep deprivation are almost invisible to anyone who does not know the target well. A colleague sees someone tired, short-tempered, less productive. Those are common human states. They suggest nothing unusual. The colleague sees the exhaustion, and never once sees whatever it was that produced it. So the declining performance at work, the frayed relationships, the increasingly erratic presentation, all of it becomes evidence, in the eyes of people who see effects and never causes, that the target is unstable or incompetent. The campaign manufactures the very symptoms that discredit the target, and it does so through a mechanism that leaves no trace anyone else can detect. If that is engineering, it is elegant engineering. That is what makes it frightening. The noise campaign also demonstrates something general about these tactics, which White calls technical deniability. Sound is an unusually good medium for harassment, because sound is, in the ways that matter, unrecordable as evidence of harassment. It is easy to prove that a noise happened. It is close to impossible to prove that the noise was aimed at you. The medium carries the act perfectly well, and discards the intent completely. The community's answer to that problem has been to log everything. The knowledge base describes one such practice, the 1000-event memory log, kept entirely outside formal academic or legal frameworks. Its own entry is blunt about the limits. Critics note the risk of confirmation bias, where a person catalogs the events that fit a belief they already hold. And courts, so far, have given these logs no recognized evidentiary weight at all. Consider what a recording actually establishes. A recording of banging proves that banging occurred at a time at a volume. It does not prove the banging was directed at the person in the next room. It does not prove the timing was chosen. It does not prove that 4 separate noise sources were coordinated by anyone. The thing that would make the recording meaningful is precisely the thing a recording cannot capture. To establish the pattern, a target would have to record continuously for weeks or months, while simultaneously documenting their own behavior, when they tried to sleep, when they changed rooms, when they left the house. Only then does the contingency become visible. It is technically possible. It is also enormously demanding of someone who has not slept properly in months, which is precisely the state the campaign has already produced. Even a perfect record stays open to other readings. The noise may be coincidental. The person may be hypersensitive. The correlation may be an artifact of their own selective attention. The knowledge base describes one attempt to meet that problem head-on. A scoring model that rates each reported attack from 0 to 10, weighting corroboration, completeness, how soon it was recorded, and how well it cross-references other accounts in the same archive. That initiative projected more than 1.4 million structured submissions from an estimated 14,000 participants. Whether it reaches those numbers is unknown, and the projection is not a finding. But the ambition tells you what is required. The standard of proof needed to establish a noise campaign is far higher than the standard needed to run one, and White argues that asymmetry is not an accident. It is the design. Here is where the evidence runs out, and it runs out on both sides. No one has demonstrated a coordinated noise campaign in court. No one has explained away the consistency of the accounts either. What we can do is keep mapping the anatomy. The noise campaign is what happens to a target at home. The next question is where else the harassment concentrates, and why those places in particular. That asymmetry, cheap to inflict, expensive to prove, runs through every tactic on the menu. But the menu is not spread evenly across a life. White identifies 3 settings where the harassment concentrates: the workplace, the educational campus, and the residential neighborhood. Each offers the perpetrators specific structural advantages. Each imposes on the target specific limits on escape, on response, on the simple option of walking away. We begin where the record is thickest. The workplace is, in many ways, an ideal environment for organized stalking. The target must return to the same building and to the same people every single day. Attendance is not optional, not without consequences that include loss of livelihood, loss of references, and loss of a professional identity built over years. Whatever happens inside those walls, the target comes back tomorrow morning. That compulsion is the structural advantage, and the perpetrators need nothing else. Ordinary office politics supplies endless plausible cover. The target is frozen out of meetings, left off email chains, met with small hostile remarks in corridors. Every one of those has an innocent reading, and the institution reaches for it. Here is somebody who does not fit in, who cannot get along with colleagues, whose interpersonal style is the real problem. The behavior is visible to everyone. The pattern behind it is visible to no one. The stakes are unusually high. A job carries income, benefits, a career trajectory, a professional reputation, and a large share of an adult's social world. Losing it to coordinated harassment is not merely an economic catastrophe. It is a social and a psychological one. The knowledge base entry on decisional privacy makes the same point from the clinical side. Sustained external interference produces anxiety, helplessness, identity disruption, and withdrawal from the relationships that might otherwise steady a person. This has a formal academic name and a literature stretching back decades. Researchers call it mobbing. Heinz Lehmann, a Swedish psychologist who studied the phenomenon through the 1980s and 90s, gave it its working definition and its first systematic taxonomy. That matters enormously here because it means the core behavior White describes was investigated, measured, and published in peer-reviewed journals long before anyone used the phrase organized stalking. The vocabulary is different. The conduct is not. Lehmann defined mobbing as hostile and unethical communication, directed in a systematic way, by one or a number of persons, mainly toward one individual. Read that slowly. Systematic. A number of persons. One individual. Those 3 elements are precisely what critics say cannot happen, and a mainstream occupational psychologist put them in a journal definition 4 decades ago, describing offices in Sweden, not conspiracies anywhere. The finding was ordinary. Its implications are not. Lehmann documented the tactics: social isolation, humiliation, excessive monitoring, meaningless tasks, and the steady spreading of rumors. He documented the effects to severe distress, psychosomatic illness, and in many cases the target driven out entirely. The knowledge base entry on white torture explains why isolation does such damage. Without conversation, contact or eye contact, people lose social validation, then a stable sense of self. Compare Layman's list with the master menu. It is the same list. Here is the honest division. On the left, what is documented? Groups really do systematically target single individuals with coordinated, low-level harassment inside institutions. That is not disputed. On the right, the extension, the claim that the same mechanism operates beyond the office walls, in the street, the neighborhood, the whole social environment, carried out by strangers rather than colleagues. That extension is where mainstream research stops following, and it is a claim, not a finding. Even so, the mobbing literature is the single strongest piece of independent corroboration the organized stalking account has. It establishes, in peer-reviewed form, that the mechanism is real, that coordinated group harassment of one person is a documented workplace phenomenon with a measurable clinical toll. What remains contested is scope, not existence. That distinction is worth holding onto, because it is the distinction most public argument about this subject collapses. Both sides lose something by collapsing it. White describes how the workplace campaign typically unfolds. First, isolation. The target is cut out of informal communication, the corridor conversations where real information moves. Then task manipulation. Work far beneath their competence, to humiliate or far beyond it, to guarantee failure. Then the drip of minor hostile acts, each too small to report, cumulatively unbearable. And finally the exit, termination, or a resignation the target is maneuvered into offering. By then, the record already agrees. The workplace is also the setting where the mechanics are least deniable, because it leaves paper. Emails have timestamps. Performance reviews have authors. Human resources complaints are logged, and rotas, room bookings, and access records all exist independently of the target's testimony. Elsewhere, the harassment is diffuse and unrecorded. Here, the concentration of actors and the institution's own bureaucracy produce a far richer evidentiary record than a street or a stairwell ever will. And the termination, when it comes, does a second job. It supplies fresh ammunition for the lie campaign. The target was let go for poor performance, which seems to prove whatever the rumors claimed. The knowledge base notes that in Socialist Workers' Party versus Attorney General, the documented pattern of disruption included exactly this shape, surveillance without evidence of crime, infiltration, and personal sabotage. Cause becomes consequence, and consequence feeds back as cause. This is why documentation matters so much, and why the community has industrialized it. The knowledge base describes an initiative called SCORE, which collects structured attack documentation interviews and grades each submission on a 0 to 10 evidence quality scale, weighting corroboration density, completeness, and temporal proximity. It projected over 1.4 million structured submissions from around 14,000 active participants. Whether that volume converts into legal weight is, as yet, entirely unproven. The knowledge base is blunt about that. Now change the setting. For targets who are students, the educational campus replicates the workplace pattern almost exactly, the captive attendance, the fixed cast of people, the reputational stakes, with one crucial addition. The campus comes with its own mental health apparatus, built in, free at the point of use, and woven into every other service the student depends on. White's title for this section is deliberately bleak. Help, she argues, becomes the trap. White writes that with the participation of a large group, fellow students, sometimes staff, a targeted student's life can be ruined, and that the target can get no help from the very staff paid to resolve student problems. The reason, she says, is that complaints will bring the full weight of the mental health system down on a totally innocent target. That is her claim, stated plainly, and it is not an evidenced finding. The campus is a controlled environment in ways that make it unusually dangerous for a target. A student sits under institutional authority in 4 dimensions at once: academic, disciplinary, residential, and medical. The same organization grades them, disciplines them, houses them, and assesses their mental state. In a workplace, at least those functions sit with different bodies. On a campus, they converge on a single administration, and a judgment formed in one dimension travels instantly to the others. Consider what happens when the student tries to report. Whatever door they choose, they are describing behavior that may involve other students, support staff, sometimes faculty, people whose standing inside that institution is almost certainly higher than a first year's. The complaint is not merely improbable. It is improbable and inconvenient, aimed at the institution's own members, and made by the person in the room with the least accumulated credibility to spend. So the institution does what institutions do. Faced with a report of something it does not recognize as a crime, it reclassifies the problem as personal rather than criminal, and routes it to the counseling service. This is rarely malice. The protocols genuinely send unusual complaints toward mental health assessment, and the counselor is the professional whose job description most nearly matches what the student appears to need. Good procedure, wrong category, and the error compounds from there. Once the student is inside the mental health system, the logic from Chapter 1 takes hold. The report sounds implausible, so it is read as a symptom, and every later interaction is filtered through the presumption that this is a patient rather than a victim. Disciplinary hearings, academic accommodations, housing decisions, each becomes a place where the psychiatric framing quietly lowers the student's credibility, and none of them ever revisits the original question. The institution that should have protected the student has become an instrument of the harassment, not because anyone inside it is complicit, but because standard procedure produces the wrong outcome for a problem it was never designed to hold. Here the evidence thins. White offers no campus case studies. Her book is a field guide, not a casebook. What follows is the cost of a diagnosis received young, and then the last setting, home. Alone, each of these events is unremarkable. A rent rise, a job application that vanishes, a neighbor who behaves oddly for a fortnight. Taken together, they form a pattern the target may begin to notice but cannot yet prove is connected. And that gap between noticing and proving is where this chapter lives. The third rung of the ladder is where the pattern acquires people, and the people acquire intent. The third rung is active social manipulation. Informants, workplace mobbing, the orchestrated encounter. Eleanor White's field guide cataloged these tactics in detail, and the Mind Weapon document folds them into its Phase 1 model without ever naming them. Here the target becomes aware that something is happening. But the something is social, not technological, and social harm is almost impossible to separate from ordinary misfortune, office politics, or a family quarrel that got out of hand. Set the rungs out in order and the shape becomes plain. Passive observation, environmental shaping, social manipulation, the breaking of institutional supports. Then the turn, and then what the document calls Phase 2. The document never describes this latter explicitly. It is implied by the model, and we are reconstructing it. That reconstruction matters because it explains why targets describe what happened to them as a process rather than as an event. The knowledge base entry on Watcher Services is careful with its verbs. It says these are cases community researchers have attempted to document, and that the individual's report being followed. Report not proved. The same entry notes something else worth holding on to. Watcher teams, where they appear in declassified Cold War counterintelligence records, break off contact the moment they believe they have been spotted. That behavior makes any surveillance claim structurally difficult to evidence. There is documented precedent for the third rung, though not for its modern form. In 1971, activists burgled a small FBI field office and released files showing that the Bureau monitored and disrupted peaceful political activity. Years later, in the Socialist Workers' Party litigation, A federal court examined a pattern the knowledge base summarizes as surveillance without evidence of crime, infiltration, and personal sabotage. That is the historical floor beneath these claims. The fourth rung is the breaking of the target's institutional supports: the job, the housing, the medical care, the legal recourse. The document describes these losses as the output of Phase 1. Not side effects, but products. At this rung, the target's ability to defend themselves through ordinary channels is gone. Not weakened, gone. And the losses arrive in an order that makes each following loss easier to inflict and harder to contest. Consider what each loss actually removes. Income buys a lawyer's time. Without it, the courts are theoretical. Health cover buys the medical record that would document an injury. Without it, there is no chart, no scan, no dated note. Housing buys an address, and an address is what employers, banks, and courts require before they will deal with you. Friendship buys a witness. Strip all four away and the person is unrepresented. This is the sentence in the chapter worth sitting with. The breaking is not merely psychological. It is logistical. A target who has lost their job, their home, and their access to medical care has lost the practical infrastructure of self-defense. Whatever combination of coordinated action, institutional failure, and plain bad luck produced that state, the state itself has one consequence. The person can no longer generate the evidence that being believed would require. So targets document. The knowledge base describes an initiative called SCORE, which gathered structured attack documentation interviews and rated each submission on a 0 to 10 evidence quality scale, weighting corroboration, completeness, and how soon after an incident the report was filed. It projected accumulating more than 1.4 million structured submissions from roughly 14,000 active participants. Those are projections rather than results, but the effort behind them is real, and it is enormous. The limits are just as real. The knowledge base entry on the 1000-event memory log states plainly that such logs carry no recognized evidentiary value in court, and that critics see in them a risk of confirmation bias, cataloging the events that fit and passing over those that do not. The one-voice declaration guide is equally blunt about what documenting cannot do. Cannot start an investigation. Cannot make anyone believe you. The fifth rung is the one the document calls the turn. Exhaustion, regret, remorse, trauma, breakdown. The knowledge-based literature on coercive environments describes something adjacent. Margaret Singer's work on thought reform treats isolation as the critical condition because it leaves exactly one source of validation standing. The literature on prolonged social isolation describes depersonalization and a loss of identity. These are not the same phenomenon. They describe what sustained isolation does to a person. And the sixth rung is phase 2 itself. The head pain, the voices, the bodily pain that the document attributes to directed energy. We have crossed the whole ladder in a few minutes. A target crosses it across years. Everything up to the fifth rung has documented analogs in intelligence history and in the coercive control literature. The sixth rung does not. That asymmetry is the honest summary of where we currently stand. The latter matters because it explains a sentence targets say constantly. I didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. The early rungs are indistinguishable from ordinary life. There is no moment at which anyone can point and say, this is where it started, because the start was designed to be invisible. By the time the pattern is recognized, the fourth and fifth rungs are already behind them, and credibility is gone. Step back from this single document now and ask a wider question. The Mind Weapon compilation is not the only framework that tries to describe how targeting proceeds from first contact to sustained assault. There are Eleanor White's field guides, the online communities built around particular technologies, the compiled testimonies of European advocacy organizations, and a small body of sympathetic academic work. Reading the two-phase model against all of them is the next task. Across that literature, one structure recurs: observation first, then isolation, then direct harm. The vocabulary varies. The specific technologies named vary. The attribution of cause varies enormously. One account says intelligence agency, another says organized crime, another says a neighborhood recruited by somebody unseen. But the sequence stays put. That consistency, like the consistency of the symptom reports we examined earlier, is data. It is a pattern demanding explanation, whatever explanation eventually proves correct. Listen to how many names the same three-beat story travels under. Gang stalking, organized stalking, cause stalking, community-based harassment, electronic harassment, remote neural monitoring, voice-to-skull, usually written V2K. Each label carries a different theory of who is doing this and by what means. Strip the labels away and the underlying arc is nearly identical, which is exactly what makes the convergence interesting, and exactly what demands the most care from us. So separate the two columns honestly. What varies? The named perpetrator, the named technology, the proposed mechanism, the timeline, the geography. What recurs? Surveillance before isolation, isolation before harm, and the target's discovery of the pattern only after their supports have gone. Convergence on structure while diverging on content is the more interesting finding, because structure is harder to copy by accident than a phrase or a piece of jargon. But convergence has to be discounted, and the knowledge base supplies the reason itself. A corpus analysis of thousands of submitted documents found that most of the highest similarity pairs were not independent accounts at all. They were the same reporting template, the quick attack log, filed by different people. Shared forms and a shared vocabulary manufacture agreement. Any honest reading of the convergence has to subtract the part the templates produced. What makes this document distinctive is not the sequence but the causal claim inside it. In most accounts, isolation and assault are two bad things that happened in that order with nothing joining them. The mined weapon document insists on a link. Isolation is not merely prior to assault. Isolation is the condition that makes assault possible. Access to the person, the document states, is the purpose for which the isolation was engineered. In that framing, the target's losses are not collateral damage. They are the operational precondition for everything that follows. It is a darker claim, a more coherent one, and far harder to verify. Between the losses and the pain sits a state the document names with unusual precision. Regret, remorse, loss, trauma, drained and broken. That hinge is where we go next, and it is exactly where the document stops explaining itself. Regret, remorse, loss, trauma. These are not operational terms. They are experiential ones. They describe what a person feels, not what a machine measures. No instrument reads them off a dial. That distinction matters because the document is about to use this emotional state as though it were a switch, a threshold that, once crossed, permits something else to begin. Before we follow that claim, we should be honest about what kind of language we are standing on. Set the causal claim aside for a moment and look only at the human state. Exhaustion, grief and trauma following sustained job loss, housing loss and relational rupture are not exotic conditions. They are among the best documented responses in the whole of clinical literature. Whatever the ultimate cause of the losses, the aftermath is ordinary and predictable. A person stripped of income, shelter, and companionship will suffer. That much requires no unusual mechanism and no unusual explanation. Three separate bodies of research converge on the same finding. The psychiatric literature documents major depressive episodes triggered by life stressors. The sociological literature tracks the cumulative damage of unemployment and housing instability. The trauma literature describes what sustained, inescapable threat does to a nervous system. None of these fields needs a directed energy weapon to explain the state the document names. Each of them, on its own, would predict exhaustion in a person who had lost everything. So we hold two things at once, and holding both is the whole discipline of this section. The document's specific causal claim, that this drained state functions as a trigger for directed energy assault, is unverified, and unverifiable from the document alone. The underlying human experience it describes, being drained and broken by accumulated loss, is entirely plausible and entirely consistent with what trauma research tells us. One half of the sentence is ordinary, the other half is not. That is the entire hinge, in the compiler's own words. 6 nouns and 2 adjectives, carrying the weight of a causal argument. The knowledge base entry on white torture describes something adjacent and documented. Prolonged social isolation deprives a person of validation and support, producing abandonment, depersonalization, and a loss of identity. That is a recognized effect of isolation. What the document adds silently is that this recognized effect opens a door. It does not say how. A person who suffered the losses cataloged in Section 2 would be expected to experience distress. That is not in dispute, and it should not be minimized. The open question is narrower and sharper. Does that distress then serve as a trigger for something additional, for a second phase, delivered by an outside party at a chosen moment? On that question, and only that question, the document offers assertion rather than evidence. It states, it does not show. Hold that gap in mind because the document is about to fill it. And it fills it with an object. Up to this point, the chapter has moved through surveillance, informants, workplace pressure, and institutional collapse. Harms that leave paperwork, witnesses, and case law behind them. What comes next leaves none of that. The street outside is about to stop being the story, and the inside of a human skull is about to become it. Section 3.2. Microchips at the hinge. It is worth noticing exactly where in the document the microchip claim resurfaces. Not in the Phase 1 toolkit list where it might belong alongside the radar and the intercepts. It appears here at the hinge, at the precise moment the text moves out of exhaustion and into physical pain. Placement in a document is rarely accidental, and this placement is doing work. The sentence is short. Many have been implanted with microchips. It arrives immediately before the description of head pain and voices, and it arrives without a date, a method, or a source. The knowledge base entry on Tempest, summarizing this same compilation, records the structure plainly. Phase 1 uses intercepts, radar, informants, and neighbors to isolate. Phase 2 follows with implantation, head pain, and auditory phenomena. Even the summary keeps the order. Implantable transponders are real objects. That part is not contested. The knowledge base holds contemporary reporting from around 2001, when an American technology firm publicly denied any plan to develop an implantable device, insisting it was building only an external wearable one, before that position shifted after the September 11th attacks. Implantable chips exist. What does not exist in the public record is a verified recovery of a covert one from a target. So the placement does real narrative work. It offers a physical, tangible mechanism, a chip, an implant, a device you could theoretically hold in your hand, at exactly the moment the document needs to explain how an emotional state becomes a physical one. Without it, the text would have to jump from despair to pain with nothing in between. With it, there is something solid to point at. Solidity is not the same as evidence. Consider the position of the reader by this point. They have followed the document through the losses of Phase 1 and the exhaustion of the turn. Something terrible has happened. Something worse is coming. Into that state, the document introduces a cause, implantation, that feels concrete. The abstract horror of psychological collapse gives way to a more comprehensible horror, a foreign object inside one's own body. That is easier to grasp and easier to believe. Now, the rhetorical function of a claim does not make that claim true, and it does not make it false either. Noticing that a sentence is well placed tells you nothing about whether the thing it describes occurred. But the effectiveness is itself worth noticing, because it explains why this particular claim travels so far and so fast through the literature. The document is not merely cataloging tactics here. It is narrating. Read the passage as a hinge sentence and its structure becomes visible. 3 clauses do the work of an entire causal argument. Regret, remorse of loss, trauma, the emotional state. Many have been implanted with microchips, the physical mechanism. Begin experiencing extreme pain to their head, the onset of phase 2. Between the first clause and the second, no bridge is offered. Between the second and the third, none either. Notice the grammar. The verbs are passive, have been implanted, so no actor appears. The sequence is asserted rather than argued. And the gaps between the clauses are precisely the gaps the rest of this chapter has to navigate. We are not told why a drained and broken emotional state would coincide with, let alone enable, the onset of physical pain. The connective tissue of the argument is simply missing. Take the implantation clause on its own and count what is absent. We are not told when the alleged implantation occurred, during phase 1, before it, or at the turn itself. We are not told what kind of implant is claimed, what it looks like, how large it is, or where in the body it sits. We are not told how it communicates, or how it receives the energy that supposedly causes the pain. We are simply moved, in the space of one sentence, from one register of suffering to another. And this is where the claim shifts most dramatically. Everything before it, surveillance, informants, social harm, has real documented analogs. The knowledge base records them. A Bureau counterintelligence program running from 1956, a domestic operation that opened files on anti-war activists, a burglary in 1971 that put the evidence in public hands. Those are court records, declassified files, and congressional findings. The knowledge base notes that the Socialist Workers' Party case established, in court, a pattern of surveillance without evidence of crime, infiltration, and personal sabotage. That is the terrain on the near side of the pivot sentence. On the far side lies a claim of directly inflicted bodily pain, delivered by unspecified technological means, with no comparable record behind it. The change in evidentiary footing is total. We mark that shift here deliberately, and not as a dismissal. The knowledge base is candid that incident logs kept by targets carry no recognized evidentiary weight in court, and that critics see confirmation bias in them. It is equally candid that structured, cross-referenced documentation, scored for corroboration, completeness, and timing, is the only route by which testimony becomes something an investigator can test. That work belongs on the far side of this sentence. Hold the whole of it together, then. Everything before this sentence rests on more grounded terrain than everything after it. That is the honest summary of the hinge, and it is the map we carry forward. Because the far side is where we go next, into phase 2 itself, into the weapons catalog, the document names, and into the single laboratory result from 1962 that the whole assault claim quietly leans upon. So we set the electronic layer to one side, bracketed and unresolved, and come back to the human machinery. Everything this chapter has laid out so far, the menu of tactics, the staging, the settings, the recruitment, has been pieces of one larger thing. Now we assemble it. Eleanor White calls the result deniability, and the claim of this section is that deniability is no accident. It is built in 5 reinforcing layers. The architecture has 5 layers. Every visible act is staged to look like ordinary life. The evidence of coordination fragments across many witnesses. The phenomenon travels under a half-dozen competing names. A target who reports it is redirected into psychiatry. And the accusation underneath the whole business is never made anywhere it could be answered. We will take them one at a time, and then watch what happens when they run together. Layer 1 is the staging of visible acts. Street theater reads as a random interaction. A noise campaign sounds like inconsiderate neighbors. A convoy of vehicles looks like ordinary traffic. Workplace mobbing looks like office politics. Every element a casual witness might see carries a perfectly innocent surface explanation, and any single element, reported on its own, would be dismissed by any reasonable observer as trivial or as coincidence. That dismissal is the design. Notice what the staging costs the target. To describe the harassment truthfully, you have to describe events that sound like nothing at all. A man coughed as you passed. Car parked, then left. A colleague repeated a phrase you had said in private. Each sentence lands as either trivial or paranoid, depending on the listener, and there is no third reading available. The material is ordinary. The claim built from it is not. Layer 2 is the fragmentation of evidence. Because the harassment is distributed across many actors and many moments, no single observer, not a neighbor, not a colleague, not an attending officer, ever sees enough of it to recognize a pattern. The fragments scatter across time, across location, and across the memories of people who will never compare notes. They accumulate into a coherent picture from exactly one vantage point, and that one belongs to the complainant. That point deserves some weight. The only person positioned to see the whole pattern is the target, and the target's account is discounted automatically, precisely because they are the one making the complaint. It is a closed circle. The best-placed witness is the least credible witness, by definition rather than by evidence. White does not offer this as an unlucky coincidence. She offers it as a property the operation depends on, and probably selects for. Consider the officer taking the report. He is handed 100 trivial incidents and asked to see coordination in them. He has no corroborating witness, no named suspect, no continuity between events, and no offense he could reasonably charge. Nothing in his training tells him what to do with a claim about a pattern rather than an act. So the report is filed, and the file goes nowhere. That outcome requires no corruption whatsoever. Layer 3 is the naming problem. The same phenomenon travels under a crowd of names. Gang stalking, group stalking, community stalking, cause stalking, mobbing, organized stalking, electronic harassment. Each name carries its own connotations, its own online community, and its own credibility profile. The knowledge base holds several of these as separate concept articles, because the literature itself treats them separately. One thing, described in 7 vocabularies, is extremely hard to count. The consequence is quiet, and it is serious. A journalist researching gang stalking finds one set of sources. A researcher investigating cause stalking finds another. Neither body of evidence accumulates with the other, and the scattered vocabulary prevents exactly the kind of consolidation that normally comes before a new category of crime is recognized by institutions. Before a thing can be investigated properly, it needs one name. This has never had one. Layer 4 is the mental health trap. A target tries to convey, to an officer or a doctor or a relative, the accumulated weight of hundreds of individually trivial events. The account sounds implausible because it describes a pattern that no single listener can verify. Implausibility then invites a clinical explanation. The problem is not in the world, the reasoning goes, but in the reporter's perception of the world. And there the file closes. The labels applied are usually delusional disorder, persecutory type, or paranoid personality disorder. Once that conversion happens, it does not reverse. A complainant has become a patient, and every later complaint arrives pre-explained. This is why the TI-1 voice declaration, in its section 3.2, asks for something that sounds modest and is not. Not a finding, not a verdict, only that the account be treated as warranting investigation. The clinical label then does a second kind of work. The knowledge base, in its articles on isolation in coercive settings, describes how stripping away a person's sources of validation leaves them unsteady, dependent, and easy to disbelieve. A diagnosis achieves much of that socially. Friends adjust their tone. Family begins managing the person rather than listening to them. Nobody involved has to be malicious for the effect to arrive. Layer 5 is the due process void. Whatever accusation set the harassment in motion, a rumor, a grievance, a fabricated justification used to recruit participants, is never made in a forum where the target can answer it. There is no charge, no hearing, no evidence to examine, no verdict to appeal. Set that beside even the most imperfect formal process, and what is missing is not fairness exactly. What is missing is the procedure. And because no accusation was ever filed, there is nothing to be cleared of. Acquittal requires a charge. Exoneration requires a record. The target is tried, convicted and sentenced by a process with no formal existence, which means it offers no route to reversal, no date on which it ends, and no authority anyone could petition. Whatever else the harassment is, this feature of it is structural, and time does not soften it. It is worth pausing on how unusual that is. Almost every serious accusation a modern society makes against a person comes with a forum attached. A court, a tribunal, a disciplinary hearing, an appeal. The forum is the thing that makes an accusation answerable. Remove it and you keep every consequence of having been accused, while removing every protection that normally travels with them. That, in one sentence, is the target's legal position. Now put the 5 layers together because they do not operate separately. The staging makes each act deniable. Deniability fragments the evidence. Fragmented evidence makes the report sound implausible. Implausibility triggers the clinical response. The clinical response discredits the reporter, which raises the deniability of everything that follows, which permits escalation, which deepens the isolation, which makes the pattern harder still to convey. This is not a stack. It is a loop. White's summary of all this is a single sentence, quoted back in Chapter 1 and worth repeating, because it names the mechanism exactly. Deniability, on her account, is not a fixed property of the crime. It is a variable, and it rises with the scale, the duration, and the intensity of the operation. The more that is done to a target, the harder it becomes to prove that anything was done at all. If the architecture defeats individual testimony, the countermove has to be collective. The knowledge base records an initiative called SCORE, which gathered structured attack documentation interviews and scored each submission for corroboration density, completeness, and timing on a scale of 0 to 10. It projected roughly 1.4 million structured submissions from about 14,000 participants. That figure is a projection, not an achieved count, and the distinction matters a great deal. Here are the honest limits. The 5-layer model describes how the reports hang together. It does not establish that any coordinating body exists. The knowledge base itself states plainly that no documented evidence supports the existence of organized gang-stalking programs. And a model that neatly explains its own invisibility is genuinely difficult to test, which is a real weakness and not a rhetorical trick. Both of those things are true at the same time. So the architecture is a hypothesis with a shape, and the shape is testable in one respect. Named tactics can be logged separately, dated, and compared across people who have never met each other. Convergence can be measured. Intention cannot. That is where the chapter turns next. Having described the anatomy, the question becomes what recognizing it actually changes, for the target, for the researcher, and for the work of making this visible. Deniability, we said, is not static. It rises with the scale and the duration of the operation, and each turn of the loop tightens it. That is where the description ends. But description was never the point. Naming the menu, the staging, the settings, the electronic layer, and the deniability architecture only matters if the naming changes something. So ask the harder question. What does recognizing the anatomy actually change, and for whom? For the individual target, the anatomy converts chaos into pattern. Months or years of scattered, humiliating, impossible to explain events resolve into a structure with named components. Street theater, the noise campaign, the vehicle convoy, workplace mobbing, the staging principle. the mental health trap. None of that is new to the target's experience, but it is new to the target's vocabulary. And having language for a thing, White argues, is the first step towards documenting it. Consider 2 sentences a target might say to a police officer. The first one is, "Strange things keep happening to me." The second is, "I am experiencing these specific tactics from a known catalog, and here is my log of each one." The words describe the same life. Only one of them can be checked. The chapter is careful here. The language does not prove the crime. It makes the crime provable in principle. So the mechanism is simple, and it is worth stating plainly. Each named tactic can be documented on its own. A vehicle convoy is a set of license plates and timestamps. A noise campaign is a sound meter and a dated diary. A workplace pattern is a paper trail of complaints, rotas, and transfers. Assemble enough of those, and the pattern is built from documentation rather than asserted from memory. That is the whole evidential argument in 4 steps, and each one is ordinary. Name the tactic so it can be recognized when it recurs. Log every instance with a date, a time, and a place. Seek corroboration, a witness, a photograph, a recording, a second target. Then let the pattern emerge from the accumulated record. No single entry proves anything. The chapter's claim is that the record, taken together, might. The anatomy also does something quieter for the target. It reframes divergence. Your account does not match another target's account. And for years that mismatch has fed self-doubt on both sides. Under the menu model, divergence is not a sign of unreliability. It is the expected signature of customized harassment. The chapter puts it exactly. My program is different from yours because the menu is large, and we were served different meals. That single sentence dissolves a problem the community has carried for decades. When each target believes their experience is unique, solidarity is almost impossible. Every meeting turns into an argument about whose account is the real one. When they recognize that different experiences are selections from one shared catalog, the argument loses its point. This is a reframing, not a finding. It does not prove a catalog exists. It removes a reason to disbelieve each other. Here the discipline of this series demands a counterweight, and the knowledge base supplies one. Its entry on the 1000 event memory log is blunt. Such logs, it records, carry no recognized evidentiary value in courts, and critics warn that they can reinforce confirmation bias, because a person may catalog only the events that fit what they already believe. Documentation is necessary. On its own, the knowledge base is clear, it is not sufficient. The same double edge runs through the vocabulary itself. The knowledge base entry on the targeted individual community notes that shared language lets members label and categorize experiences in ways that are meaningful within the framework. That is the benefit. The cost is that a shared vocabulary can also shape what people notice and how they report it. Both things are true at once, and an honest anatomy has to hold them together. The knowledge base also records an attempt to answer that objection with method. A project called SCORE asked participants to complete structured attack documentation interviews, then scored each submission on a 0 to 10 scale, weighing corroboration density, completeness, how soon the account was recorded, and how richly it cross-referenced others. It projected 1.4 million structured submissions from roughly 14,000 participants. That figure is a projection from a plan, not a result anyone has reported. That is the target side of it. For the researcher and the advocate, the anatomy provides a method, and its first rule is a separation. Keep the well-documented human tactics apart from the contested electronic claims, and weigh each against its own evidence base. Do not let the strength of the mobbing research lend borrowed credibility to the microwave hearing claims. And do not let doubt about the second contaminate the first. For moves follow from that first rule. Separate the two evidence bases, and say plainly which is which. Anchor the human tactics to the academic literature that already exists. Treat deniability as a signpost. Wherever you find a mechanism manufacturing cover for an ambiguous event, look beneath it for the coordination the cover conceals. And build cumulatively, because each documented instance strengthens the case for a tactic even when no single instance settles it. Anchoring simply means naming the shelf on which the evidence already sits. The workplace variant belongs to the mobbing literature, decades of peer-reviewed research into coordinated harassment inside institutions. The lie campaign belongs to the research on rumor transmission. The psychology of ordinary participation belongs to the conformity and obedience studies. None of that literature was written about organized stalking. All of it describes the mechanisms this account depends on being real. The anatomy also writes the research agenda, and these are ordinary empirical questions. Which items on the master menu are most common? Which ones co-occur? Does the mix vary by target category, by region, by decade? Are the electronic reports correlated with particular human tactics which would suggest coordination, or do they vary independently which would not? Surveys, structured interviews, and comparative case analysis could answer these. Work at that scale has barely begun. One document in the knowledge base shows both the promise and the difficulty at once. An anonymized analysis of community submissions found a highly standardized approach to documentation, dominated by a single repeated reporting template appearing near identically across different users. For analysis, that standardization is a gift because it makes accounts comparable. For evidence, it is a complication, because near-identical documents are harder for an outside investigator to treat as genuinely independent testimony. Which brings us to the third audience, and the largest claim in the chapter. A crime cannot be legislated against until it can be described. Cannot be described until its components are named. It cannot be investigated until those names give evidence somewhere to go. So the anatomy is not the case. It is the infrastructure a case would need, the vocabulary that legislation, enforcement, and public education would all sit on. The knowledge base contains one attempt to model what recognition would actually require. A TI-1 voice study addendum sets out 3 pillars: law enforcement and intelligence authorities, governments and legislative bodies, and the medical and scientific community, and argues that recognition has to come before justice. It attaches projected dates to each pillar. Those dates are the output of a model with assumptions inside it, not a schedule. The same knowledge base holds the TI-1 voice declaration, which asks for exactly what the anatomy makes askable: formal recognition of the declarant as a crime victim, and recognition by clinicians that the described phenomena warrant investigation. Its own guide is unusually honest about limits. It does not start an investigation. It does not guarantee anyone will believe you. It creates a documented record. That is the realistic claim. White states the thesis at the end of her first chapter, and the whole descriptive project rests on it. Notice what she does not say. She does not promise prosecutions or compensation, or an admission from any institution. She says that publicity itself would make the crime unsustainable. That is a hypothesis about secrecy rather than a documented finding, but it explains why so much effort here goes into naming things precisely. So the mystery that protects the crime is dismantled one name tactic at a time, communicated to a journalist, a legislator, a police trainer, a medical educator. Which raises the obvious test. Take a single item off the menu, the workplace variant, and see what happens when mainstream science studies it properly for decades. That is where we go next, beginning with the work of the Swedish psychologist Heinz Lehmann. The bodies that oversee the intelligence community examine agencies, not the complaints of private citizens, and a civilian has no access to classified material anyway. The Freedom of Information Act, the ordinary citizen's lever, is useless against a program whose very existence may be classified above the level that act can reach. What remains is a vacuum. The target holds a claim that is specific, detailed, and sincerely held, and no office has the duty to test it. Be careful with what that vacuum means because it is not a verdict. Nothing about the absence of an investigating body tells you whether the underlying claim is true or false. The vacuum is a structural fact about how responsibilities were divided up decades ago by people who never imagined this category of complaint. No agency was ever assigned the harm this target describes. That is an administrative accident, not a finding, and the two get constantly confused. Here is the point toward which the whole two-phase model converges. Phase 1 strips the target of the people who might vouch for them, so credibility is gone before anything is reported. Phase 2 is said to inflict harm that leaves no trace a laboratory can confirm. And the institutional vacuum ensures neither half is ever formally examined. The document describes a self-sealing system, harm that cannot be proved, investigated by nobody with an incentive to try. That sentence does not come from the targeted individual literature at all. It is a founding principle of the Istanbul Protocol, the United Nations Manual for Investigating and Documenting Torture, and the knowledge base entry records it as explicitly stated in the text. It exists because torturers learned, long ago, to leave nothing visible behind. Investigators needed a written rule that stopped a clean medical examination from quietly closing a case all by itself. The Istanbul Protocol matters here for a reason worth stating precisely. It is a working standard, used in real torture investigations, covering interview technique, the documentation of scars and injuries, the assessment of psychological consequences, and the writing of reports for legal proceedings. It proves that institutions can be built to examine harm which leaves no mark. But a protocol only guides an investigation, cannot conjure one into existence where no authority will accept the file. There is documented precedent for institutions underrating harm they cannot see. The knowledge base entry on Ireland versus the United Kingdom describes a European human rights case in which severe psychological techniques were legally minimized precisely because they left no visible injury. In 2018, a revision was sought, based on newly declassified papers said to show deliberate intent. Whatever its outcome, the pattern is real, and targets cite it constantly for exactly that reason. Set the machinery aside for a moment and stand in one person's shoes. Someone is in genuine physical pain. Their symptoms do not map cleanly onto any recognized diagnosis. They walk into a medical system built, sensibly, around mechanisms it can confirm. What happens next is not a conspiracy, and it is nobody's cruelty. It is a mismatch between an experience and a framework, and it produces some of the most durable harm in this subject. The doctor orders tests because that is what a careful doctor does. Bloods, imaging, referrals to specialists. The results come back normal. Now, a normal result is not the same finding as nothing being wrong. It means nothing was found by the instruments that were used. But in practice, a clean set of results closes a line of inquiry rather than opening a new one, and the patient is left holding a symptom the record cannot hold. Listen closely to the translation that happens in that room. The patient says, "But the pain is real." The doctor hears and writes, "Pain of unknown origin." Both sentences are honest. Neither one is a lie. Yet the gap between them cannot be bridged by anything the patient is able to say, because what the patient is actually claiming, that an unknown weapon is doing this, is not a category the diagnostic framework contains. Here is where the real institutional harm accumulates. A patient who keeps attributing their symptoms to an external weapon risks a psychiatric label, delusional disorder, somatic type, or schizophrenia, paranoid type. Once that label is on file, every later report of pain is read through it as a symptom of the condition rather than a report about the body. And the label reinforces itself. The more the patient insists, the more the insistence resembles proof. This next point deserves emphasis, because it is one of the few places in the chapter where the ground is genuinely firm. medicine's tendency to convert unexplained symptoms into psychiatric diagnoses, and the difficulty of escaping that conversion once it happens, is documented in the mainstream literature on medically unexplained symptoms and diagnostic uncertainty. It is not special pleading, and it is not unique to targeted individuals. It may simply find its sharpest expression here. One word does an enormous amount of work in this argument, and it deserves handling in the open. Confabulation, in the knowledge-based definition, is the production of false memory without any intent to deceive. Critics of the targeted individual account reach for it to explain detailed reports of surveillance and mind control. Advocates answer that it has been weaponized, applied in advance to any testimony at all, discrediting genuine survivors without examining a single case. So let us state the editorial center of this chapter directly. We do not know what produces the head pain, the voices, and the bodily pain that hundreds of people report. The compilation itself admits the mechanism is unknown. What is not in doubt is that the distress is severe, sincerely reported, remarkably consistent across accounts gathered independently of each other, and followed by real consequences. Lost work, lost homes, ruptured families, whatever their ultimate cause. There are two easy exits from this chapter, and both of them are dishonest. The first is to declare the technology proven, which hands ammunition to anyone waiting for a single overstatement to check. The second is to dismiss the testimony because the mechanism is unverified, which abandons people in genuine distress to systems not built to help them. Holding both truths at once is harder than picking one. It is also the only honest place to stand. In practice, that stance asks something of everyone in the room. The person suffering is asked to record what happened precisely, without asserting a mechanism they cannot demonstrate. The clinician is asked to treat the distress as real while the cause stays genuinely open, which is a normal medical position and not a concession. And anyone studying this is asked to weigh each claim against its own evidence, rather than against the strongest claim standing next to it. If no institution will investigate, the record has to be built from below. The knowledge base describes an initiative called SCORE, which gathered structured attack documentation interviews and rated each on a 0 to 10 evidence quality scale, weighing corroboration, completeness, timing, and cross-referencing. It projected 14,000 participants and over 1.4 million submissions. Treat those as targets rather than achievements, and note the analysis warning that many logs reuse one identical template. The knowledge base also sets out what closing that vacuum would actually require. Its recognition model names 3 pillars: law enforcement, legislatures, and the medical and scientific community. The one-voice declaration puts the same demand into legal language, formal recognition of a declarant as a crime victim, medical acknowledgement that the phenomena warrant investigation, and access to victim services. Its own guide is blunt. Signing starts no investigation and guarantees that nobody will believe you. We come to a sentence the compilation states plainly, and we include it because leaving it out would understate what this subject costs the people inside it. Many, it says, take their lives. There is no count offered, no rate, and no citation. That makes it a claim rather than a statistic, and we treat it as that. But we will not treat it as a casual line, and we will not use it for effect. Whatever combination of causes eventually explains the pain, the voices, and the isolation described across this chapter, the outcome named there is the gravest cost there is. It deserves care. So if any of this has landed close to your own life, or the life of someone you know, tell another person today, a friend, a doctor, a crisis line in your country. One voice exists partly because isolation makes suffering unbearable and unheard. That is Chapter 5. Consistent testimony, an institutional vacuum, a medical framework that cannot hold the complaint, and a cost stated without any evidence yet impossible to ignore. What remains is the harder analytical task. In the final chapter, we put the two-phase model on the table piece by piece: Phase 1, the turn; Phase 2, and ask which pieces rest on documented ground and which rest on the document's own confidence. The mobbing research gave us solid ground. Now the chapter walks onto its most contested territory, and it walks slowly. What follows is not an argument that the electronic layer is real. It is a catalog of what targets consistently describe. The reason for the care is practical. Sensational or sloppy descriptions of the electronic claims are the single most reliable way to get the well-documented human tactics dismissed alongside them. The chapter divides the reports into 3 families. Through-wall sensations, meaning things felt on or in the body with no visible source. In the head audio, meaning sound that seems to bypass the ears entirely. And body influence, meaning movement, mood, or thought that feels externally imposed. Every one of these is testimony. None of it is presented here as a proven mechanism. Holding that line is what lets the description be taken seriously at all. Through-wall effects are the most commonly reported family. Pressure, described as an invisible weight on a specific part of the body. Vibration, like standing near heavy machinery. Heat, sometimes with visible reddening of the skin. Tingling, like a mild current. And sharp, localized pain. What unites them is not the sensation itself but the interpretation. The target experiences the pain as arriving from outside, rather than arising from a condition within. Voice to skull, or V2K, is where a genuine science meets an ungenuine leap. The microwave auditory effect entered the peer-reviewed literature in 1962, and the United States Army has researched it openly since the 1960s. So the concept is not fantasy. But the published demonstrations are brief clicks and tones in a laboratory. The distance between that and sustained, interactive speech delivered covertly is vast, and this chapter does not claim it has been closed. It is worth being blunt about why this care matters. Every time a claim is stated as proven when it is merely asserted, a critic gains a free win, and the win is not confined to that claim. It spreads backwards over the street theater, the noise campaigns, the workplace mobbing, all the material that is genuinely documented. Precision is not timidity here. It is the only protection the testimony actually has. The third family is the hardest. Targets describe involuntary muscle movement, sensations of being physically restrained, and shifts in mood or thinking that feel imposed rather than generated. In extreme accounts, the experience of being remotely controlled. The chapter holds 2 things at once here. The consistency of the testimony across cultures and decades is a real datum that deserves explaining. And no public demonstration exists of any deployable technology that could produce these effects selectively, at range. Sorting the reports by evidential standing is the most useful thing a viewer can take from this section. One tier rests on published laboratory work. A second rests on convergent testimony with no confirmed mechanism. A third rests on testimony alone, and is the least characterized of all. They are not equal, and collapsing them into one block is precisely how the entire subject gets waved away. Later episodes assess each reported technology against physics and engineering. Now the chapter turns from what is reported to who reports it. Before the internet, a target's isolation was close to total. Each person experienced what appeared to be a unique and inexplicable persecution, with no way of discovering that anyone else in the world was describing the same thing. There was no forum, no search, no way to compare notes. Whatever was happening, you were carrying the whole of it alone. From the late 1990s onward, that changed. Forums, mailing lists, dedicated websites, and video channels let targets find each other. The discovery was transformative, and the chapter is careful about why. A stranger in another country with no possible contact with you, describing the same staged skits, the same noise, the same convoys, is a kind of evidence that no amount of solitary record-keeping can produce. The vocabulary itself came from that convergence. The academic record is thin, and honesty requires stating what is in it. In 2015, forensic psychologists Lorraine Sheridan and David James published a case series of 128 self-reported group stalking cases, comparing them with conventional stalking. Their conclusion that the accounts were delusional in origin is disputed throughout the community, and the series returns to it. A 2020 phenomenology paper took a different route, letting themes emerge from the accounts themselves. Within the community, being a targeted individual is not only a description. It becomes an identity, and the chapter treats that with real balance. The identity delivers solidarity, a framework, and practical method. It also carries risks that the book names plainly. Over-identification, where a whole self-concept organizes around victimhood. Insularity, where internal discourse drifts from outside reality testing. And a hardened suspicion that ends up rejecting researchers and advocates who are genuinely trying to help. The chapter's closing move on the community is its sharpest. The community is both the archive of the crime and, in part, a product of it. Targets built their own infrastructure of documentation and support because the institutions that should have archived and investigated declined to do so. So the community is a source, holding the largest body of testimony in existence. It is also a subject because its very existence measures an institutional failure. Let us assemble the episode. A master menu of tactics, one catalog customized endlessly to local conditions. Each act staged as one of life's normal breaks, so it survives description as coincidence. A witness who only ever sees a fragment. A report that consequently sounds absurd to the person receiving it. An isolation as the output. The architecture does not merely commit the harm. It manufactures its own cover as a byproduct. 6 things this episode put on the table. A shared tactical menu, customized locally. A staging principle that dresses every act as one of life's normal breaks. Street theater where the skit becomes the weapon. Noise campaigns where repetition converts nuisance into genuine injury. Institutional settings where authority and proximity are already sitting there waiting to be used. And a discipline of separating the documented human layer from the contested electronic one. Now the honest part. Nothing in this episode identifies an organization, a chain of command, or a source of funding. Nothing measures how many participants a campaign actually requires. No public demonstration matches the covert, individually targeted delivery that the electronic accounts describe. And there is no register of targets anywhere, which means every percentage you will ever hear about this subject is missing its denominator. That is where the evidence genuinely runs out. One sentence from this chapter is worth carrying out of the episode. The community is both the archive of the crime and, in some respects, a product of it. Read it slowly. It means the record exists only because the people harmed built it themselves, in the absence of anyone official who would. That is a statement about targets. It is also, quietly, a statement about every institution that had the option to look and did not. Our anchors for this episode were these. Chapter 2 of Knowledge Targeting. Eleanor White's Organized Stalking, Knowledge Base number 765. David Lawson's Field Investigations. Heinz Lehmann's Mobbing Research from 1990. The Sheridan and James Case Series of 2015, and the 2020 Phenomenology paper. Supporting material came from the TI-1 Voice Knowledge Base. Every image credit is listed in full in the companion article, alongside every claim and its source. If this episode described your week rather than a chapter of a book, please know you are not carrying it alone. TI-1 Voice is a platform built by targeted individuals for targeted individuals. An evidence library, a knowledge base of thousands of documents, a community wall, and documentation tools designed for exactly the kind of pattern that resists proof. TITV runs alongside it around the clock. Both are free and the links are below. Part 2 described the machine. Part 3 asks the question every target asks first and answers last. Why me? The next episode examines how the lie campaign meets the master menu, recruiting neighbors and colleagues who would otherwise have no reason to touch you, by giving them a story about you first. It also faces the cruelest feature of the whole design. Most targets never find out what they were accused of. You cannot investigate a pattern when you have only ever been shown one piece of it. That is the entire lesson of this chapter, and the reason for describing the anatomy so carefully. Thank you for giving 2 hours to a subject that is heavy in every direction. Be gentle with yourself tonight, take whatever time you need, and we will see you in part 3, the why you question.